You will sign the papers before this holiday weekend ends, or you can forget the inheritance your grandmother left for this family. Everyone in this office can hear me, Chloe, and they should know exactly how little you have contributed while living under the family name. Your aunt and I protected those assets for years, and I will not let your selfishness destroy what is left. If you refuse me here in front of your coworkers, I will make sure every relative understands the kind of daughter you chose to become. This is the last time I will offer you a place in this family, so decide right now whether you want to keep pretending you matter. Hi, my name is Chloe Parker, I am 29 years old. That was how my mother chose to open the conversation on the Friday afternoon before the extended holiday weekend, standing in the middle of the open plan office where I worked as community outreach coordinator for a small environmental nonprofit in Burlington. My aunt stood slightly behind her, arms folded, nodding at every word as if she had rehearsed the timing. I had not invited them. I had not even known they were in Vermont. One moment I was finishing a grant report at my desk, the next moment the two of them were in the doorway and every head in the room had turned. My supervisor, Eric Lawson, stepped out of his glass office the second the volume rose. He looked at me with the quiet question people use when they are trying not to make a scene worse. I told him it was family business and that I would handle it outside. My mother refused to move. She held up a thin manila folder like it contained the only truth that mattered and said the inheritance documents required my signature before Monday or the entire arrangement would collapse. My aunt added that the family had already waited long enough and that my delay was starting to look deliberate. I felt the familiar tightness settle under my ribs, the same pressure that had lived there for years whenever money and obligation were used in the same sentence. I asked them, as calmly as I could manage, to step into the small conference room so we would not continue this in front of the entire staff. They followed, but the door stayed open. My mother placed the folder on the table and opened it to a single page that looked official enough to pass a quick glance. She told me the family assets had been carefully preserved and that my share would be released only after I agreed to certain conditions. Those conditions, she said, included transferring a portion of any future proceeds back into a joint account she controlled and agreeing never to question how the original principal had been managed. My aunt leaned in and said the quiet part out loud. She told me that if I walked away from the offer I would also be walking away from any claim to the family cabin, the savings accounts, and the goodwill of every relative who still believed the money existed. I asked, carefully, whether the assets were still intact. My mother answered that of course they were intact and that only a child who had never sacrificed anything would dare ask such a question. The tone was pure contempt wrapped in the soft language of disappointment. I looked at the page again. Something about the language felt off, the same way certain promises had always felt off in our family. I told them I needed time to read everything properly and that I would not sign anything under pressure in the middle of a workday. My mother closed the folder with a sharp snap and said time was exactly what I no longer had. She informed me that the holiday weekend was the final window and that if I did not appear at the cabin by Saturday morning with the signed papers she would begin contacting the rest of the relatives to explain that I had refused my grandmother's wishes. My aunt added that they had already spoken to my cousin Megan and that Megan fully supported the plan. The mention of my cousin landed harder than I expected. Megan had always been the one relative who seemed to stay out of the worst of the family politics. Hearing her name used as leverage made the room feel smaller. I asked whether Megan had actually seen the documents. My mother smiled the thin smile she reserved for moments when she knew she had the advantage and said Megan trusted her completely. Eric knocked once on the open door and asked if everything was all right. I told him yes, even though nothing was all right. My mother turned to him and said, in a voice meant to carry, that some daughters simply refuse to honor the people who raised them. Then she and my aunt left the way they had arrived, without another word to me, the folder still in my mother's hand. I sat alone in the conference room for several minutes after they were gone. The grant report on my computer screen looked like it belonged to someone else's life. I kept replaying the conversation, searching for the exact moment the inheritance had turned from a distant family story into a weapon aimed directly at me. I had never been shown account statements. I had never been given a clear list of what remained. Every time I asked in the past I had been told that asking was proof I cared more about money than about family. Later that afternoon my phone buzzed with a text from my father. He wrote only that my mother was upset and that I should try harder not to create drama during the holiday. I did not answer. I finished the workday in a kind of automatic haze, answered emails, nodded when people spoke, and left the office the moment the clock allowed. On the quiet street where I lived I found my neighbor Janet Crowley watering the small patch of flowers between our porches. She asked if I was all right. I said I was fine. She studied my face for a second longer than politeness required and then simply nodded, the way people do when they know better than to push. Inside my apartment I placed the manila folder on the kitchen table and stared at it. I still had not opened it again. Part of me already knew that whatever numbers were printed inside would not match the story my mother had told for years. That night I received a short voice message from my aunt. She said the family was gathering at the cabin for the long weekend and that my absence would be noticed. She added that my mother was prepared to make certain announcements if I continued to refuse. The message ended with a soft, almost gentle reminder that inheritance was a privilege, not a right, and that privileges could be withdrawn. I sat on the edge of my bed and listened to the message twice. The familiar ache of being the person who always had to decide how much of herself to surrender rose again, slow and heavy. I thought about the years of quiet compliance, the times I had stayed silent so holidays could stay peaceful, the way every question about money had been answered with guilt instead of facts. Saturday morning arrived with no further contact. I told myself I would drive to the cabin, listen to whatever new version of the story they offered, and then decide. I packed an overnight bag more out of habit than intention. Before I left I sent a single text to Gloria Simmons, the longtime family friend who had known my grandmother better than almost anyone. I asked if she was free to talk later. She replied that she was always free for me. I was halfway to the cabin when my phone rang. It was my cousin Megan. Her voice was tight. She said my mother and my aunt had already told several relatives that I was trying to block the inheritance and that I had refused to sign necessary papers. She said the story was spreading quickly and that people were already choosing sides. I asked her whether she had seen any actual documents. There was a long pause. Then she said she had only been told what my mother wanted her to believe. I pulled over to the side of the road and sat with the engine idling. The first major peak of the weekend had already arrived and I had not even reached the cabin yet. Everything my mother and my aunt had said in my workplace the day before was already being turned into a public narrative, and the narrative did not include any of the questions I still needed answered. If you have ever watched a parent rewrite your intentions in front of other people until you no longer recognized the story being told about you, comment me too. I need to know I am not the only one who has sat on the side of a road trying to decide whether showing up is still worth the cost. I put the car back in gear and continued toward the cabin, the manila folder still unopened on the passenger seat, the holiday weekend already heavier than any of us had admitted. I arrived at the cabin just after noon. The driveway was already full of familiar cars. My mother's sedan sat closest to the porch steps. My aunt's vehicle was parked behind it. My father's truck was farther down the gravel, as if he had tried to leave himself a quick exit. I sat in my own car for a full minute with the engine off, staring at the unopened folder on the passenger seat, before I finally stepped out and walked toward the front door. My mother opened it before I could knock. She did not smile. She simply stepped aside and said I was late. My aunt stood in the living room holding a glass of iced tea, watching me with the same assessing look she had used in my office the day before. My cousin Megan was seated on the couch, phone in her lap, eyes fixed on the floor. My father remained in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, saying nothing. I placed my overnight bag by the wall and kept the folder in my hand. My mother pointed at the dining table and told me to sit. She said the family had already waited long enough and that the weekend would not be ruined by further delays. My aunt added that several relatives had called that morning after hearing I had refused to sign. The way she said refused made it sound like a public crime. I asked, once, whether anyone in the room had actually seen current account statements or property records. My mother answered that trust was more important than paperwork and that only someone who planned to cause trouble would keep demanding numbers. My aunt nodded and said the original documents had been safely held for years. The inheritance, they both insisted, was real and waiting. Megan finally looked up. Her voice was quiet. She said she had been told the same story since she was a teenager and that she had never thought to question it. The admission hung in the air like something fragile that might break if anyone moved too quickly. My mother cut across it immediately. She told Megan that questioning family was exactly how outsiders destroyed legacies, and that she expected better from her own blood. I opened the folder. The single page inside was a simple agreement stating that in exchange for my share of the Parker family assets I would authorize my mother as sole administrator of any distributions and would forfeit any right to independent audit. There were no account numbers, no property descriptions, no dates more recent than a decade earlier. I asked where the supporting records were. My mother said they were in a safe location and would be produced after the signature, not before. The conversation circled for nearly an hour. Every time I asked a concrete question, the answer returned to duty, gratitude, and the risk of looking ungrateful in front of the wider family. My father finally spoke from the kitchen doorway. He said he wished everyone could just get along for the holiday and that I should stop making things harder than they needed to be. The words landed with the familiar weight of a man who preferred silence to conflict, even when the conflict was already sitting at his own table. I stood up and said I needed air. No one stopped me. I walked out the back door and around the side of the cabin toward the small clearing where the phone signal was strongest. I called Gloria Simmons. She answered on the second ring. I told her, in as few words as I could manage, what had been demanded of me and what the folder actually contained. There was a long pause on her end. Then she said she had been waiting for this conversation for a long time and that she needed to see me in person before the weekend ended. She would not say more over the phone. When I returned to the cabin, my aunt was on the porch speaking quietly into her cell phone. The door was open just enough that her voice carried. I stopped short of the steps and listened. She was telling someone that the girl was still resisting and that they might need to accelerate the story about the missing funds. She said the original accounts had been emptied years ago and that the only thing left was the narrative. Then she noticed me. The call ended mid-sentence. She slipped the phone into her pocket and smiled as if nothing had happened. I walked past her without speaking. Inside, my mother was telling Megan that loyalty was proven by action, not by questions. My father had retreated to the living room chair with a newspaper. He was not reading. The air in the cabin felt thicker than it had an hour earlier. I sat back down at the table and said, carefully, that I had overheard enough to know the assets were no longer intact. My mother denied it at once. She said I had misunderstood a private conversation and that twisting words was exactly the kind of behavior that made people lose their place in a family. My aunt joined the denial. She claimed the phone call had been about an entirely different matter and that I was inventing problems where none existed. Megan looked between us, her expression shifting from confusion to something closer to alarm. I did not press further. I simply said I would not sign anything until I saw current records. My mother stood, collected the folder, and announced that the weekend would proceed without my cooperation and that the consequences would be mine alone. Later that evening, the house filled with the forced normalcy of a holiday meal. Relatives who had driven in for the weekend arrived with covered dishes and careful smiles. Conversation stayed on safe topics. No one mentioned the inheritance directly, yet the weight of it sat under every polite exchange. I helped clear plates. I answered small questions about work. I watched my mother move through the rooms as if the earlier confrontation had never occurred. After most of the guests had left, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. The message was short. It said an anonymous tip had been sent to the county clerk's office earlier that day regarding possible misappropriation of family trust assets connected to the Parker name. The tip referenced records that no longer matched public filings. The sender did not identify themselves. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. I showed the message to no one. I went to the small guest room that had been assigned to me, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed with the phone still in my hand. The pieces were beginning to line up in a way I could no longer ignore. The empty accounts. The carefully maintained story. The sudden urgency for a signature. The overheard admission. And now an anonymous tip that someone else had already started to pull. At the same thread. I texted Gloria again and asked if she could meet me the following morning away from the cabin. She replied that she would be at the small cafe in town at 9. I set the phone face down and tried to sleep. Sleep did not come easily. Every time I closed my eyes I heard my aunt's voice on the porch saying the accounts had been emptied years ago and that the only thing left was the narrative. Sunday morning I left the cabin before most of the house was awake. My mother was already in the kitchen. She looked at me over her coffee and said she hoped a night of reflection had restored some sense of responsibility. I told her I was going into town for a few hours. She did not ask where. She only said the family would be waiting when I returned and that decisions could not be postponed forever. I drove the quiet roads toward Burlington with the windows cracked and the radio off. The anonymous tip sat in my messages like a live wire. The overheard phone call replayed in my mind with new clarity. Whatever the original assets had once been, they were gone, and the people who claimed to protect them had known it for a long time. The inheritance promise had never been about giving me anything. It had been about keeping me quiet and compliant while the last pieces of the story were still under their control. Gloria was already at a corner table when I arrived. She looked older than the last time I had seen her, but her eyes were steady. She pushed a thin envelope across the table toward me and said she had kept certain papers from my grandmother's final years because she had never fully trusted the way the estate was handled. Inside were copies of older statements and a short letter in my grandmother's handwriting expressing concern that funds were being moved without clear explanation. Gloria told me she had received a call 2 days earlier from someone who refused to give a name. The caller had said records were about to surface and that the truth would not stay buried through another holiday. She did not know who had sent the anonymous tip, but she believed it was only the beginning. She asked me what I intended to do. I said I did not know yet. I only knew I could no longer sign a document that pretended the money still existed. When I returned to the cabin in the early afternoon, the atmosphere had shifted. My aunt met me at the door and said several relatives had been informed that I was spreading damaging rumors. My mother stood behind her and added that if I continued to question the family's integrity, she would be forced to take steps that would permanently alter my place among them. My cousin Megan was nowhere in sight. My father remained silent in his chair. I walked past them both and went to the guest room. The manila folder was no longer on the table where I had left it. In its place was a short handwritten note in my mother's handwriting. It said the offer would expire at midnight and that after that the family would proceed without me. I sat on the bed and read the note twice. The holiday weekend was only halfway over, yet the ground under every relationship in that cabin had already begun to crack. I opened my phone and looked again at the anonymous tip. Then I looked at the copies Gloria had given me. The two pieces of information sat side by side, quiet and irreversible. Whatever happened next, the carefully maintained story was no longer the only version that existed. I stayed in the guest room only long enough to gather the copies Gloria had given me and a screenshot of the anonymous tip. When I walked back into the main room, my mother and my aunt were waiting as if they had timed my return. My father still occupied the same chair. My cousin Megan had reappeared and stood near the window, arms wrapped around herself. My mother spoke first. She said the midnight deadline still stood and that every relative who mattered had already been informed of my refusal. She said the family would move forward with or without my signature and that any further questions from me would be treated as open hostility. My aunt added that spreading unverified claims about missing money was the kind of behavior that permanently damaged a person's standing. Both of them looked at me with the calm certainty of people who believed the narrative still belonged to them. I placed Gloria's papers and my phone on the table between us. I told them the accounts had been emptied years earlier and that the inheritance they kept promising no longer existed. I told them I had overheard the conversation on the porch. I told them an anonymous tip had already reached the county clerk. The room went very quiet. My mother's face did not change at first. Then the careful mask slipped just enough for anger to show underneath. She said I had no proof that would hold up anywhere that mattered. She said family matters stayed inside the family and that bringing outsiders into private business was unforgivable. My aunt reached for the papers as if she could simply take them back. I kept my hand on them. Megan's voice cut through the tension. She asked, almost in a whisper, whether the money had really been gone the entire time she had been told it was waiting for all of us. No one answered her. That was when Gloria Simmons walked through the front door. She had not been invited. She had simply decided the time for waiting was over. She carried a small folder of her own and greeted my father with the familiar warmth of someone who had known the family longer than most of the people in the room. Then she looked at my mother and my aunt and said she had kept quiet for too many years out of respect for the dead and that the respect had finally run out. Gloria placed her own copies beside mine. She explained, in the steady voice of a woman who had rehearsed the truth only to herself, that my grandmother had expressed repeated concern about funds being moved without clear records. She said she had held on to the statements and the letter because she had never trusted the explanations that followed. She said the anonymous tip had come from her. She had filed it after our conversation the day before because she could no longer watch another generation be controlled by a story that had stopped being true long ago. The silence that followed was different from any that had come before. My aunt recovered first. She accused Gloria of interfering in private family business and of turning a holiday weekend into a public spectacle. My mother turned on me and said I had brought a stranger into their home to destroy what little dignity the family had left. I answered that Gloria was not a stranger and that the dignity had already been spent years earlier when the accounts were emptied and the promises continued. My father finally rose from his chair. He looked older than I had ever seen him. He asked, in a voice that barely carried, whether any of it was still recoverable. Gloria answered that most of it was not. The money had been gone long enough that recovery was unlikely. What remained was only the choice of whether to keep pretending. My father sat back down without another word. My mother tried one last time to regain control. She said the family would still stand together if I would simply stop pushing. She said belonging required loyalty and that loyalty required silence about uncomfortable truths. I looked at her and felt the last thin thread of obligation finally loosen. I told her I would no longer sign anything. I told her I would no longer pretend the inheritance existed. I told her the only thing I still owed the family was honesty, and I had just given it. I collected my bag and the papers. Megan stepped forward as if she wanted to say something, then stopped. My aunt called after me that I would regret walking away from the only people who had ever claimed me. I did not turn around. Gloria walked out with me. We stood for a moment beside my car while the afternoon light settled over the quiet road. She said she was sorry it had taken so long for the truth to surface. I told her the timing no longer mattered. What mattered was that the story had finally stopped belonging only to the people who needed it to stay false. I drove away from the cabin without looking back. The holiday weekend continued for the others without me. In the days that followed, I learned that several relatives had contacted the county clerk on their own after the tip became known. The carefully maintained narrative began to unravel in small, irreversible pieces. My mother and my aunt attempted to contain the damage with new explanations, but the explanations no longer held. My father remained largely silent. Megan eventually reached out to say she was still trying to understand how much of her own history had been built on the same empty promise. I returned to my quiet street in Burlington and to the ordinary rhythm of work. Eric Lawson asked only once if everything at home had been resolved. I told him it had been resolved in the only way that mattered. Janet Crowley left a small container of soup on my porch the evening I came back and did not ask questions. The gestures were small and steady and required nothing in return. The feeling of belonging that had once attached itself to family gatherings and shared stories did not return. In its place settled something quieter and more reliable. I no longer measured my worth by whether I was included in plans that required my silence. I no longer shaped my answers to keep the peace. The inheritance that had never truly existed stopped occupying space in my thoughts. What remained was the simple knowledge that I had chosen not to sign my name to a lie. Weeks later I received one final message from my mother. It said the family had moved on and that the door would remain closed until I was ready to apologize for the damage I had caused. I did not reply. The absence of a reply felt cleaner than any argument. I deleted the message and returned to the life I was building without the weight of a story that had never been mine to carry. I am still learning how to sit with the quiet that follows a boundary. Some days the silence feels like loss. Most days it feels like the first honest air I have breathed in years. Self-respect, I have discovered, is not loud. It does not need an audience. It simply refuses to abandon itself for the comfort of people who have already chosen a different truth. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever chosen self-respect over the familiar ache of belonging to people who required your silence, comment me too and tell me how you found your way through it.